So this is the 7th edition. That's very good to know. And so the fact that they've sustained this tempo year after year to get all the young, bright minds here and discuss about current topical issues is something that we must compliment them and wish them all luck in ensuring that there is greater awareness that's brought about on current issues of Tibet. It's ingrained in our consciousness, and every Indian worth his salt is very aware of the complexities involved in supporting Tibetans here. We support them individually and as a group, but there are other geopolitical constraints which the panelists will also look at. And by and large, these forums should provide us an opportunity to shape our way ahead options and see how can we get more people to be stakeholders in this journey of achieving the aspirations of these people who are with us. So with that, I will not take too much of time because of these constraints. I'm sure the organizers will remind me if you are overshooting the session. So this one has been titled as Foreign Policy, Diplomacy, and Geopolitics. So we have 4 papers here, and one is by Prosper Malangmei, who is the first speaker, who will talk about Tibet factor in India-China relations, historical legacies, and diplomatic tensions. I will also just briefly cover their bios, though it's in your folder. Maybe I can skip that too, because it's already there, and in the interest of time, I can skip the introductions of the speakers. The next one is by Aastha Binzani. I've gone through all the abstracts and I found it very, very interesting. And in fact, I think the paper by Aastha Binzani is provocative, to say the least, and I'm happy it's provocative because, it brings into focus a lot of questions that are there related to what has been the response of the Indian government and the people, what are the kind of challenges that there are. So I'm sure she will have a phenomenal number of questions that will be thrown at her, and I'm happy about it. And then, of course, we have Dr. Chitta Ranjan Malik, and who will talk to us on India and Tibet, geopolitical complexities, diplomatic imperatives, and strategic futures. And, of course, the last speaker, I think that's, again, I found from the abstract a very interesting paper, which looks at, generations of Tibetans who have been here since their displacement, and the way where Karnataka has been a house, and he's concentrated on interviewing some other people there, and trying to analyze and to see how are they going to preserve their identity, what are the measures that are being adopted by them. And so that again will be a very interesting thing to see in terms of how, the first generation of people who come to India would like to maintain that ethos and tempo of maintaining their identity, cultural identity, within in a democratic system of India, which is fully supportive of their aspirations. So without much ado, let me request the first speaker, Prosper, to kindly go ahead. Keep it to 15 minutes, otherwise he will come after you. Wherever you have a PPT?
Yes, sir.
All right. Wherever you are comfortable. You can use it from here or from there.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. At the very outset, I would like to thank Tibet Policy Institute for accepting my abstract and this paper for presentation in this 7th Young Indian Scholar Conference on Tibetan Studies. And the title of my paper is Tibet Factor in India-China Relation, Historical Legacies and Diplomatic Tensions. And I'm Prosper Malangmei, currently teaching in Department of Political Science at Maharaja Bodhchandra College in Manipur. And at the same time, I'm also pursuing my PhD in the Department of Political Science and Human Rights at Indira Gandhi National Tribal University Regional Campus in Manipur. So in this presentation, I have tried to draw from historical legacies, diplomatic narratives, and theoretical insights. And I have also tried to analyze Tibet not only as a territorial dispute, but also as a securitized and symbolic issues. So this Tibet is not just a geographical plateau, but it has become a political and strategic pivot in Asia. And now it is at the center of India-China bilateral relation, and it is shaping how India and China view each other. So these issues started way back in the Simla Conventions of 1914, where this tripartite talks between British India, China, and Tibet was held in order to decide the border issues. And so this Simla Convention of 1914 issues is also reflected in current Galwan class of 2020. So this Tibet contested status, it generated mistrust, and it presently influences military strategies and safe diplomacies. So just going back to a bit of history, in 1950, after the formations of People's Republic of China in 1949, PLA, this People's Liberation Army, entered Tibet and occupied Tibet, and it ended its autonomy and also abolished the buffer status that existed between India and China. And then again, after the Tibetan uprising, Dalai Lama had to flee Lhasa, Tibet, and seek refuge in India. And then consequently, in 1962, due to the border issues, it led to a 1962 war. So these historical events, which was shown in this 1950s and 60s, continue to define this India-China relations today. So how does China's views Tibet? So according to China, Tibet is considered as a core interest. So basically, core interest means that Tibet is a core interest, which basically means it is an issue of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, which cannot be never compromised, and it is a red line in diplomacy in regards to China. And this foreign country cannot cross this red line. So China will not compromise in this issue. So the narrative from the Chinese side is that it was a peaceful liberation of Tibet, and it ended feudalism in Tibet, and it also ended the foreign interference in its internal affairs. And presently, China has tightened its control over Tibet through its national security law, which was enacted in 2015. Again, it also enacted this in 2020 regulation called Regulation on the Establishment of a Model Area for Ethnic Unity and Progress in Tibet. So for China, Tibet is not just a region for China, but it is a symbol for national unity, and which is also a red line in diplomacy. So in contrast to China, how does India view this Tibet issue? For India, it is a security issues, because as I have mentioned that Tibet was a buffer zone between India and China, and so after this invasion of PLA, buffer zone has been lost, so it has become a security threat for India. And then why Dalai Lama has been granted Islam in India? It is because India wants to project itself as a democratic country where pluralism is allowed. But this has reinforced the suspicion that India is supporting Tibetan separatism. So it has created a permanent political dimensions in India-China relations. And India also adopts this strategic ambiguity in its policy towards Tibetan issues. So on one hand, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Prime Minister in 2023, when he visited China, he recognized Tibet as a part of China. But at the same time, India is hosting Tibetan institution or Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala, which is a strategic ambiguity on the part of India. So this policy although it's avoid escalation, but it has its own limitations. So in order to understand these factors, I have tried to use these securitization theories and constructivism. So in this constructivism theories, it states that political issues become security issues when leaders frame it as an existential threat. So now China has used this theory, or on this basis, China has securitized Tibet by portraying the Tibetan identity and activism as a threat to its national unity. So this low surveillance and military build-ups on the plateaus are justified through this lens of existential security. And then constructivism propounded by Alexander When says that states act not just on power but on shared ideas, identities, and norm. So China's framed this Tibet as a proof of its civilization revival and sovereignty. And at the same time, India as a pluralist democracy presents itself as a safe haven for Tibetan exiled communities and its culture. So securitization explains the security paranoia and militarizations around Tibet, and then this constructivism explains the clash of identities and legitimacy narrative. So going back a bit to Simla 1914 conventions. So this Simla convention of 1914, it resulted into McMahon line, which was accepted by Indian government, and so Indian government bordered stands on this McMahon line, but China has refused to accept this McMahon line or Simla Convention treaty because it says that Tibet does not have any authority to negotiate this border issue. So from the perspective of Beijing, this Simla Convention was a violation of its sovereignty during its century of humiliation. And for India, this McMahon lines become a legal basis for this border negotiation. So this historical baggage has installed this mistrust into this India and China bilateral relations. And now the 17-point agreement, which was signed in 1951, and is officially titled as Agreement on Measure for Peaceful Liberation of Tibet. So this formally marked the incorporation of Tibet into People's Republic of China and ending political economy. And China has tried to project this agreement as a voluntary agreement guaranteeing this autonomy and religious freedom. But Tibetan community has said that it was signed under duress and there was no scope for any negotiation. So again, during this period, our Prime Minister Nehru also signed this Panchil agreement, believing that this will bring about a peaceful relation in the bilateral relation, but it did not result into peaceful relation. But then it ultimately led to a 1962 war. So this 1951 agreement also set the stage for Tibet's securitizations and unraveling of this trust between India and China. And then the uprising, then this turning point came in 1959 when this Tibetan rose against the Chinese occupations. And then there was an apprehension that Dalai Lama would be kidnapped by the Chinese government, so he had made a plan and then he escaped to India, and then political refuge was provided by the Indian government, and then it led to establishment also this central Tibetan administration presently in Dharamshala, and which also institutionalized the Tibet exile politics. So this 1959 episodes marked the shift from suspicion to hostility. So this, and now this exile politics has transformed this Tibet into a frontier, into a strategic variable in India-China rivalry. So, since 1959, China has massively built infrastructures in these contested border regions. For example, China has constructed this G219 highway connecting Tibet to Xinjiang, which runs across Aksai Chin. And now the Tibet has become a launch pad for surveillance, logistics, and troop deployment, which ultimately links internal security and external defense. And under the current President Xi Jinping, China also is establishing moderately prosperous villages across this contested region. In Chinese term, it's also called a Xiaokang village. So, and India is also integrating the Tibetan community in this security setup. For example, it has set up this special frontier force. But India has been very cautious, and it's maintained a strategic silence in order to escalate the relations. So now Tibet has become a strategic chessboard between India and China. So Tibet has become a silent determinant in India-China relation. So in the contemporary, this strategic dynamic has resulted into this Doklam clash and this Galwan clash. So in 2017, China wanted to construct a road in the tri-junction of India, China, and Bhutan, which was a security threat for Chicken Neck, or which is also known as Siliguri Corridor, which connect the mainland India to northeastern India. It was a 73-day standoff, but ultimately Chinese back off and did not construct the road. And then again in 2020, it led to a Galwan Valley clash, where it led to a death of 20 Indian soldiers and undisclosed number of Chinese soldiers. So this signifies that confidence building measure has also been failed. And from the perspective of India, defending Tibet is equal to defending its sovereignty. And from the India perspective, this Tibet represents a strategic threat. So these Doklams and Galwan events prove that a trust cannot survive without these genuine de-escalations and transparent communications. Again, there are competing narratives. So from the China's narrative, Tibet's integration is portrayed as a peaceful liberation which ended this feudalism, and it promotes modernizations in Tibet. Whereas from the Tibetan narrative, it's viewed as an occupation and suppression, resulting in cultural erosion and religious restrictions. And then India's narrative is that it adopts a balanced approach. It is trying to recognize Chinese sovereignty, but symbolically supporting Tibetan cultural and spiritual freedom. So these competing narratives has prevented from genuine reconciliations. So apart from this competing narrative, it also has identity and soft power aspects. So India and China want to use Tibet as a soft power. So India, by hosting Dalai Lama and Central Tibetan Administration in Dharamshala, or India, is trying to project that India is a pluralist country and it in alignment with its democratic principle. And whereas China is trying to project Tibet as a success story of its socialist modernization. And in 2021, it also released a white paper titled as Tibet since 1951, Liberation, Development and Prosperity, in which it tried to highlight the economic development and modernization in Tibet. And for Tibetan diaspora, it is acting as a norm-entrepreneur, in the words of Finmore and Sekins. So by norm-entrepreneur means that individuals or group of organizations that provide safe and institutionalized new norms for appropriate behavior in international system. So in this regard, I think the Tibet Policy Institute, by hosting such kinds of seminars and conferences, I think it is acting as a norm-entrepreneur. So what are the implications? So India policy on Tibet, by adopting this strategic ambiguity, I think currently it is not less becoming feasible or sustainable as we discuss the rise and growth of China in the international politics. So this strategic dilemma or strategic ambiguity is becoming less sustainable. And then confidence building measures has failed, which is evident from Doklam and then Galwan clash. So, and military build-up in the contested border region has also intensified mutual suspicion between China and India. And the emerging flashpoints such as this Dalai Lama reincarnation issues. So definitely there's a pressure in India, and we have to see how India is going to handle these reincarnation issues. And then now we also have ecological aspects, or the Tibetan plateau has a large glacier or fresh water, and Tibetan issues from political issue, it will also definitely have a human security aspect. So Tibet issue illustrate that hard powers alone cannot secure border. So the long-term stability will depend on this combining strategic caution with cultural diplomacy and environmental collaboration. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that Tibet should not remain a zero-sum contest. So stability in Asia depends on transforming it from a flashpoint into a platform for cooperation. And then India and China need to work on its confidence-building measures. It has to move beyond this military dialogue to include cultural exchange and ecological collaboration. And Tibet Policy Institute can also work to form a track to diplomacy where a Chinese expert or scholar can be also invited to the forum or seminar to have a genuine dialogue. And then Tibet must be de-securitized from India and China's perspective so that it can move its relation from tactical management towards genuine strategic trust building. Thank you all. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Prosper. There is a comprehensive paper which is a take-home from user discussions in terms of placing the history, from the time of Chinese occupation and His Holiness is moving away from Tibet into India's sanctuary, and there are complications thereafter, which you have done very well. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions later. But we'll move on to the next speaker, Aastha Binzani. And she can obviously develop from the word that was used by Prosper, which is strategic ambiguity. Is there a strategic ambiguity in the way that India deals with this issue? What are the compulsions which are there? What are the geostrategic challenges? And like I said, it will definitely be a provocative presentation, and I hope it will be, because there's a kind of spirit in which we need to deal with these questions without being defensive about facing these tough and real questions. Over to you, Aastha.
Yes.
15 minutes.
So, good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the Tibet Policy Institute for giving me this opportunity today. So, following from the previous presentation, my presentation looks at the other side of the coin, where I'll deal with the China factor in India's Tibet policy. And the title of our paper is Securitization and Silence, Tibetan Resistance under India's Geopolitical Constraints. The paper focuses on India's management of the Tibetan exile community in the shadow of its foreign policy priorities, in particular its relationship with China. So the arrival of Dalai Lama and tens of thousands of Tibetan refugees in 1959 turned India into the principal site of Tibetan exile communities' political and cultural life. So while existing scholarship has explored questions of citizenship, statelessness, and identity, examining the peculiar condition of Tibetans as both citizens of the government in exile and foreign guests of the Indian state, less attention has been paid to India's approach to the political agency of the exile community. Indian state's management of the Tibetan presence has produced a distinctive mode of exile governance, whereby a precarious balance is maintained between hosting the Dalai Lama and the exile government and ensuring that this presence does not disrupt ties with Beijing. So this has resulted in conditional political freedoms, giving rise to an exile politics shaped by geopolitical contingencies. Coming to the conceptual framework, to make sense of these dynamics, the paper draws from several conceptual frameworks, including strategic ambivalence, state policies that frame Tibetans simultaneously as welcome guests and as subjects to be contained, a positioning which is inseparable from India's fraught geopolitical relationships with China. The second is critical border studies, wherein borders are no longer conceived as static territorial lines, but as dispersed, mobile, and enacted across multiple sites, and feminist scholarship on silencing. So all of these, just a second. Yeah. So taken together, these frameworks then illuminate how India manages Tibetan exile life through a complex assemblage of preemptive compliance, tacit sovereignty, bordering practices, and symbolic silencing. All of these notions will be explored as the presentation proceeds. Coming to the historical context, so immediately upon independence, there was emphasis on Tibetan autonomy under nominal Chinese sovereignty in continuation of colonial legacy. However, a shift occurred as India began to pursue non-alignment Asian solidarity, which also was coupled with consideration of military weakness and territorial security issues, and there was a prioritization of cordial ties with China. All of this culminated into the 1954 Panchsheel Agreement, where India recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. However, the 1915 uprising and Dalai Lama's asylum resulted in another turning point. So, though the asylum was provided on humanitarian grounds, Prime Minister Nehru was, by most accounts, a reluctant host, acutely aware that this decision would complicate relations with Beijing. However, as tensions came to a head beginning in the 60s, culminating in the 62 war, it heralded a period of greater tolerance of hitherto prohibited activities. During this period, CTA built exile institutions, Dalai Lama adopted a Tibetan constitution, sought international support for the Tibetan cause, and India itself supported the UNGA 1965 resolution on fundamental human rights of the Tibetans. But there was a reset in relations with 1988 Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing, and this came in the context of the 1987 Lhasa protest and imposition of martial law in 1989, which indicated a greater Chinese securitization of Tibetan issue, which had implications for India's position. So India again reaffirmed Tibet as the autonomous region of China, committed to curbing anti-China activities in the exile community, and this resulted in the emergence of strategic ambivalence, where there was hosting of Dalai Lama in the CTA while simultaneously constraining of political agency. And so all of these dynamics included coexistence between hospitality and legal ambiguity, and autonomy and containment. So India's reception of Tibetan refugees is often described as exceptionally generous, yet this celebrated hospitality remains precarious, lacking a clear legal foundation. India is not party to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and therefore the exile community is governed by Foreigners Act of 1946, the Registration of Foreigners Act of 1939, whereby Tibetans are classified as foreigners or aliens. There is no distinct refugee protection framework under Indian law, which makes their governance subject to executive discretion. This results in a layered belonging, where Tibetans are present and institutionally organized, yet they are persistently peripheral in legal and political terms. Coming to autonomy and containment, the government in exile administers housing, welfare, schooling, local governance, creating a semblance of autonomy, but this creates what Fiona McConnell calls territorial exceptions, spaces where Tibetan institutions operate, but only under the umbrella of Indian sovereignty. Indian law ultimately prevails, and the movement of Tibetans into and outside of settlements has long been subjected to permits and monitoring by local authorities. And this arrangement illustrates what she again terms as tacit sovereignty. So the government in exile operates like a state in exile, with the Indian state facilitating this quasi-sovereignty tacitly, but always within limits. Another aspect of this dynamic is preemptive, what the paper terms preemptive compliance, which refers to practice of detaining Tibetan activists, enforcing restrictions on demonstrations, discouraging displays of Tibetan nationalism evident during anniversaries of Tibetan uprisings or visits by Chinese dignitaries, a state practice which forecloses dissent before it can materialize. The practice became distinctly evident beginning with the 1991 visit of Premier Li Peng to India and has been routinized since then. So this is like a report of Premier Li Peng's visit, and as I've highlighted, the only point of contention was the Tibetan issue. New Delhi was clearly determined to ensure that Li Peng would not be embarrassed and went out of its way to reiterate that Tibet was an autonomous region of China. A day earlier, the Indian authorities prevented the Dalai Lama from meeting his followers or the press at the Delhi airport. The police also arrested several Tibetan exiles and beat up protesters at Majnuka Tila in a distant part of Delhi where a demonstration was earlier allowed. So, So this is getting routinized. So we see this pattern repeating again and again. So the next was when, during the 2008 Olympic torch relay, police detained hundreds of Tibetans, confiscated Tibetan flags, and prohibited their display near the India Gate route. Reports describe activists hiding flags beneath their clothing, which led to mass arrests once they were discovered. So the irony of India's Tibet policy is starkly embodied in the 1993 agreement on the maintenance of peace and tranquility along the line of actual control between India and China. So the treaty gestures towards the stabilization of a fraught border and the cultivation of conditions of regional peace. Yet, in practice, the principle of tranquility has often translated into the silencing of peaceful Tibetan dissent within Indian territory. This contradiction came into sharp relief in the lead-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, when Indian authorities detained Tibetan demonstrators during a protest march, charging them with endangering the peace and tranquility of the region. Similarly, in 2012, ahead of Chinese President Hu Jintao's visit, Delhi police raided Tibetan hostels and neighborhoods, seizing flags, banners, and placards, issuing blanket bans of Tibetan national symbols in public spaces. Again, in October 2019, when Xi Jinping visited Chennai, Tibetan students and activists were detained on suspicions of planning to display black flags and Tibetan national flag. Despite some domestic discussion for a policy shift after the 2020 Galwan clashes, India's subsequent diplomatic engagements and successive boundary negotiations with China underscored its resolve to keep the Tibetan issue from obstructing efforts to stabilize bilateral relations. On 10th March 2025, the anniversary of the Tibetan national uprising, protesters waving flags outside the Tibetan embassy in New Delhi were dragged away by police and their banners confiscated. As New Delhi pursues yet another reset in ties with Beijing, this entrenched pattern of privileging overall bilateral stability over Tibetan political concerns is likely to become even more pronounced. So the outcome of this strategy is silencing. Material silencing occurs when bodies are removed from protest sites, detained or confined in settlements. Symbolic silencing takes place when visual markers of Tibetan identity, flags, slogans are banned or erased from public view. Feminist scholarship on silencing deepens this understanding by emphasizing that silencing is not merely the absence of speech, but an active practice that structures power. It operates materially by detaining bodies and restricting movements, and symbolically by curating what can appear in the public sphere. In the Tibetan case, silencing is not incidental, but systemic. It is an outcome of India's anticipatory diplomacy. Critical border studies remind us that borders are not merely territorial lines, but are enacted through documents, practices, and embodied experiences. For Tibetans in India, the border is written onto the body through the requirement of the registration certificates, the surveillance of protest, and policing of visibility. Their everyday lives are structured by a form of internal bordering where access to rights and recognitions depends on paperwork that can be withheld, delayed, or revoked at the discretion of the state. The Tibetan body itself becomes a border site, a site where India's commitment to refuge intersects with its obligation to manage Chinese sensitivities. Protests are moments where this embodied border becomes more visible, when flags are unfurled and Indian state responds by reimposing the limits of hospitality through detention and censorship. Throughout these dynamics, realpolitik remains the underlying thread. India's China policy has consistently demanded a careful balancing act, demonstrating solidarity with Tibetans without jeopardizing bilateral relations. The presence of Dalai Lama is both a symbolic asset then and also a diplomatic liability. On occasion, India has leveraged this presence as a bargaining chip, subtly signaling to China that Tibetan exile politics could be amplified or muted, depending on the state of relations. But more often, the imperative is one of restraint, ensuring that Tibetan activism does not jeopardize relations. This duality explains why India projects itself internationally as a pluralistic democracy with a tradition of offering refuge, while domestically it manages Tibetan visibility. This silencing also takes other forms. Indian media outlets and strategic commentators frequently invoke the question of Tibet to underscore the tensions underpinning India-China relations. However, in these framings, Tibetans themselves are rendered silent. Their political demands are rarely foregrounded. Tibetan identity, history, and suffering are reduced to discursive resources for Indian statecraft rather than subjects of policy concern in their own right. Exiled Tibetans who have built institutions of governance and articulated political aspirations in Dharamshala are largely excluded from formal diplomatic conversations. This absence is not accidental, but it's a structural effect of India's strategy of preemptive compliance. This absence is most evident in the instrumentalization of Tibet as a bargaining chip in Sino-Indian relations. During episodes of heightened tension, Indian officials and commentators have occasionally hinted at the possibility of amplifying Tibetan exile politics as a form of pressure on Beijing. This dual strategy, invoking Tibet when useful, silencing Tibetans where inconvenient, underscores the structural asymmetry at the heart of India's Tibet policy. Exiled Tibetans are indispensable symbols in the language of foreign policy, yet their voices are systematically absent. So in conclusion, Tibetan exile politics in India is profoundly shaped by the contingencies of India-China relations, producing a distinctive regime of exile governance. So this dynamic produces a distinctive regime. On the other hand, so this creates a paradox where Tibetans are celebrated, where their existence is celebrated symbolically as proof of India's humanitarian traditions, as moral contrasts to China's repression, and occasionally as a diplomatic card hinted at in moments of bilateral tension. On the other hand, they are materially constrained. Their protests are curtailed through preemptive detention, their flags and symbols banned during sensitive visits, to ensure that they comply with Indian priorities. The result is a paradoxical condition of controlled visibility. They are permitted to rehearse the state through institutions of exile governance, yet denied recognition in formal negotiations where the stakes of their political future are most pronounced. Foregrounding this asymmetry complicates conventional portrayals of India as a benevolent refuge. While India projects itself internationally as a pluralist democracy with a tradition of offering asylum, its actual management of Tibetan life is driven less by humanitarian concern than by realpolitik, rendering Tibetan voices present, but on terms defined by the host state. Thank you.
I must compliment you on bringing out all the paradoxes that there are and the complexities involved in this bilateral relationship. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions out there. And there are also a number of clarifications that may have be provided both by Professor Srikanth and myself. When it comes to the not defending the actions of the Indian government, but looking at it in the correct perspective. You also referred it to the Refugee Convention, of which we are not a party of. The fact that you are not a party to the Refugee Convention itself defines the way in which you are going to look at refugees, whether they are Sri Lankan Tamils, whether they are Bangladeshis, whether they are Afghans, whoever has come here, or the Rohingyas for that matter, would be governed on humanitarian grounds and not so as driven by any of the conventions that we recognize. So that's an important factor to be borne in mind. And you also highlighted many of these incidents which have taken place, and it also silences the media. I'm sure a lot of youngsters have seen this movie Rock Star, And where in the original thing there was a Tibet flag which was waved during one of the performances by the hero, and apparently coming under pressure by Chinese, this was removed thereafter. It was obliterated. So that is the extent to which that the China is monitoring the activities of refugees who have a legitimate interest in sustaining their culture, their autonomous region. Another underlying thing which came out also in the first presentation is that we are looking at the support for a Tibet autonomous region, which has been the basis for all the support that we extended, to say that while we may have accepted that it's part of China, but we do not want them to be subjected to this excessive Hanization and controls which are there, etc., etc. So these are certain complexities which are involved. You are very right in bringing out this to say and question even some of the actions of the Indian government. But like you said, these are governed by the need to maintain healthy bilateral relations, and therefore some of these excesses, or what appear as excesses, have been perhaps committed. But I'm sure the government separately would have supported the Tibetan aspirations separately. The very fact that you also highlighted that we have a government in exile on our territory tells you that we're not entirely following what the Chinese prescribe, because strictly speaking, then you should not even support a government in exile. Now, how do you support a government in exile here if you are not supportive of their aspirations? So there are some of these questions. I thought I'll just throw open some of this so that you ask more questions later on both the presentations. And now we hand you over to the next presenter, Dr. Chitta Ranjan Malik from Manikeshwari University. Over to you. 15 minutes. Yeah. By and large, I think all of them have been extremely mindful of the time, and I'm thankful to both of you for maintaining this requirement to finish everything by 11:15 or 11:20. So thank you, and I'm sure the other two speakers will maintain this likewise.
Good morning, all of you. Esteemed Chair, esteemed dignitaries on the dais and of the dais, audience, my fellow presenters. My name is Dr. Chitta Ranjan Malik, Assistant Professor in Department of Political Science, Manikeshwari University, erstwhile Kalahandi Universities, Bhavanpatna, Kalahandi, Odisha. My topics are India and Tibet, the navigating geopolitical complexities, diplomatic imperatives, and strategic futures. In introduction part, both fellow presenters also vividly and elaborately spoke. Just I speak introductions, the Tibet and India relationships with very century world. In theological dimensions, the Buddhism from India to Tibet in 17th centuries. Apart from India-Tibet relations, very close in historical, cultural, and diplomatic relations. When China occupied Tibet, all relations deteriorated, very difficult. After that, 1959, it's a historic event in Tibet. The Tibet revolutions and Dalai Lama fled to India, and India also accept and as a asylum. Then many event also happened between India and China regarding Tibet. As you know, everyone knows the Panchashil Nitis. The Panchashil, the India want to relation to China very fruitfully, but China, it is not recognized After that, 1962 war in China and India. Then many CBM measures between India and China, but all CBM measures is not fruitful. Then many historical foundations here, the similar conventions, and the Mark Miller, everyone know, it is also not fruitful. China not recognize the Mark Miller line because the China argue it is British India agreement, it is not legitimate. Then Panchashilins 1944, the idealism and ambiguity also already spoke. And then 1959 and 1962, Asylum, Explanation and War also SM also spoke. Then confidence building measure, the settlement already spoke. The strategic geography and military balance. The Tibetan plateau as a operational theatre. The Tibetan plateau is a very important for India, but many things happen there. Then infrastructure, posture also, action, reaction, dynamics. The Chinese investment in border road and tunnel and fire optics network have reduced the mobilization time. India has the respond by the accelerating the construction of the strategic highway. Then acceleration and dynamics of crisis and management. Everyone knows Galvan and Daklam incident like stone and shuffle weapon used both China army and Indian army. It is also very relationship very deteriorated after this event. Then Tibet, diaspora politics and India soft power. Dalai Lama, the India's decision to welcome the Dalai Lama and the central Tibetan administration in Dharamshala combined strategic caution with the specific moral commitment of. Then while the acknowledging the Tibet autonomous region as a part of the PRC, the New Delhi grant exile the Tibetan culture, religious autonomy and their settlement contribute to the social fabric of India's. The Dalai Lama's the international prominence strengthen India's soft power and especially by the connecting the India with the broader Asian audience through the Buddhist diplomacy. And then calibrating the political signaling, the India has the periodically modulated the visibility of the Tibetan political activities in order to the prevent jeopardizing the sensitive discussion with China while maintaining the humanitarian commitment. Then Tibet Tibetan communities, the security interface and perceptions. The Tibetan exile community and assimilations in the India in a largely effective, while the socio-economic change provide new challenge. The historically the special frontier force the implemented this create the security interface the public narrative of Tibetan engagement in the India's defense during crisis have occasionally emerged with symbolic and determinate consequence. Then water ecology and infrastructures, the Himalayan anthropologists, the third pole, India's riverine stake. Everyone knows the what's Tibetan's third poles. The third poles is three mountains like Hindukos, Karakoram, and Himalayan. The plenty of water deposited in glacier water. It is the water diplomacies. It's very important for India, but many of water flow from Tibet, like Indus, Satluj, and Brahmaputra rivers. The Tibetan plateaus contain the large cyclophonic and deposit and headwater of the major Asian rivers, such as the climate change, glaciers, and threat that change the precipitation pattern and engagement, the downturn hydraulics, the monsoon variabilities, and flood hazard from the glacier like outburst in the Himalayas make India's more vulnerable. The dam diversion and data. It is also China hydropower development on the upper Brahmaputra and on other river has sparked the worry in the India about flow variations, sediment and change, and the ecological consequence in the Arunachal Pradesh and Assam. So while China released certain hydrological data during flood sessions, India demand more robust legalities. The ground transparency brought the year. Then ecological diplomacy and early warning cooperations. The technical cooperation in hydrology, landslide monitoring, and disaster early warning systems can result in the depoliticized and channels of communication. Multilaterals, climate forum discuss the provide path to maintain ecological confidence even when the political tie are strained with real advantage of border communities. Then trade connectivities and economic independence. The prominence land limit border trade and the Nathula and other designated point reviewed limited as cross-border trade, the symbolizing the potential economic benefit of stable border. However, the strategy, competitions, and securities constraint limit scales. The Tibet integration into the China, the domestic market, the combined with the logistic route oriented north and east, limit organic India's Tibet commerce. Thus, then supply chain and strategic de-risking. The significant trade balance exists in the India's larger economic relation with China. The excluding Tibet, the following 2020s, the New Delhi has placed a strong emphasis on the strategic partnership with a like-minded nations, supply chains, and resilience, and vital economic screening. By the highlighting the need of the strategic autonomy and de-risking and Tibet factors subtle the influence these decisions. Then diplomacy, the international law, and multilateral coexistence, the USA, Europe, and global Tibet questions. The international perspectives upon the acknowledge the PRC the sovereignty while the advocating for the cultural and religious freedom as well as the substantial Tibetan autonomy. The India interests overlap with but are not identical to the Western human rights narratives. The New Delhi balance value with the neighborhood imperatives, preferring quiet diplomacies to the megaphoning politics. Then coalition and the Quad. Everyone knows the Quad. The India, Japan, and Australia is formed to check China expansionist policies. It is maritime centric rather than the Tibet centric. Nonetheless, the larger strategic signaling influence the Beijing's threat assessment across all theaters. The India gained from the issue-based alliance and that enhance the logistic and technologies. Assess the without subordinating Himalayan priorities to the external agenda. The Europe's Indo-Pacific outlook as well as chosen the technological alliance can complement this approach. And then strategic futures, the manage the deterrence and stabilization. The both parties reinvest in CBM clarity, patrol protocols, and increase crisis hotline and many disputes. The India continued to strengthen its infrastructure and military preparations, while China consulted but avoiding all things. The tension remain high, but there is less possibilities of acceleration. The economic normalization is limited in non-sensitive sectors. And then competitive coexistence with the bounded rivalries. The force posture hardens local crises reoccur, but are the content through the rapid disengagement, the economic de-risking process, the water data sharing becomes transnational. The India strengthen relationships with Quad Plus and use global platform to shape standard. That Tibet is still securitized within China with the strictly controlled religious and cultural venues. And then systematic escalation. The simultaneous crisis paired with the external regional shock of the overwhelming CBMs, escalation danger extend to the cyber space and economic sectors. Trans-boundary water conflict rise in response to the major weather occurrence. These scenarios involve large cost and unclear result, emphasizing it is importance of the preventive diplomacies. Then, in conclusion, India Tibet calculate the intertwined identities, power, geography, and histories. The unsolved Legacies, Malangmei controversy are example of the legacies that cannot be erased by the rhetoric and temporary agreements. The Tibet, the environment influence India's water securities, it is infrastructure influence, navigating Tibet's geopolitical complexities for India, call for just that, the patience with the purpose, capacity driving, bends and principle anchored and focused on the strategic future where the Himalayan serve as the both a line of defense and a frontier for collaborations. It's my point of view. I think it's a need free Tibet. In my point of view, in 21st century, no nation to colonize any nation for this contemporary world. It's also I want free Tibet and forever. Thank you for attention. Any suggestion, question, then welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chitta. Again, there's some new words which have come out in your presentation. The introductory part complemented what the first speaker brought out in terms of the historical dimensions of how we are looking at the refugee situation, the existence of Tibetans, etc. But the later part, you brought out some very new important parts related to water security, where Tibet, is the warehouse of the world for water, and therefore the relations between the upper riparian and lower riparian states which are coming to question, the building of dams and all that, which I'm sure there will be some more questions on this, on what can India do using international conventions. So those are issues which are there. You also brought in the issue of Quad, though I'm not very sure whether Quad as an organization would be highly interested in matters of refugees and Tibetans. Because at the moment it's not part of the agenda. Nothing stops us from taking that as an agenda, particularly with the participation of Japan and Australia, who are. But these are questions that we need to take up and find solutions in the future. So thank you for the presentation, and with that now we go on to the last speaker. He's got a very important presentation in my assessment because I'm part of his PhD study, and he's taken a phenomenal amount of pains to look at this cross section of people in this place called Mungod, where there's a sizable community. And so he's interviewed generations of Tibetans who are there, who can trace their cultural memory, look at the historicity of their existence, the kind of support that they received from Indian government and the state government, whether they are able to sustain their education policies. So there are phenomenal number of things which are there, which are of relevance not only to people in Mungod, but also the people here. Yesterday during the Chai Pakoda walk, my friend from Chennai, he did tell me about some of the new ways in which they are likely trying to look at the education policies here itself. And in one of the schools which we walked past, he said this is where they are trying to implement, the mother language first concept, where up to class 6, they are going to have, all the topics done here in Tibetan language. And this is a model that's been adopted here. And based on the success and relevance, perhaps it would also get implemented in other places. But these are things for the future. So without taking much of the speaker's time, let me hand over to you, Gudi, and all yours. $15 minutes?
Yes. Thank you, distinguished Chair, my co-panelists, and the other participants and the experts. Thank you, TPI, for giving me an opportunity to present my paper on Echoes of Homeland on Tibetan identity and culture memory. And my case study is the Tibetan settlement in Mungod in Karnataka. This paper is trying to explore the processes of identity constructions among the first generation the Tibetan refugees residing in the deguling Tibetan settlement in Mungod in North Karnataka. This is focusing on the elderly Tibetans who fled from Tibet in 1959 after the uprising, and after the examines how the cultural memories, the religious practices, the collective narratives, and community structures contribute in maintaining the identity of the Tibetans. And the study was conducted based on the semi-structured interviews and field-based ethnographic work. And this was highlighted as part of the research on Tibetan sustaining cultural and heritage and negotiating with the displacements, the political integrity, the matters related to the generational changes and the gaps they are witnessing here in India. Well, to start with, as we all know, that Tibetans start, in the post-1959, the settlement started in India, and Mungod was one of the early regions that was identified by the Tibetan rehabilitation centers, and subsequently that was built in the year 1966. This is a matter of a long walk, probably as in a which has happened in a non-internet era, otherwise which are well documented probably. So then the long walk that started from the Tibetan regions to the Kalimpong to the northern Indian regions and subsequently moving to the plains in the southern India, the Tibetans experienced a kind of changes, the climatic changes, the food and other things. And subsequently, the first place was that given to them in the year 1966 by the then Chief Minister of, then it was called as Mysore State, the state of Karnataka, Mr. Nidhalingappa, and who was one of the tall leaders of the Congress party. And the land was allocated, first identified on the banks of the Tungabhadra, the river on Tungabhadra, but later they said that this is going to be really humid and might be fit for the Tibetan people, and subsequently they shifted to the packs of the Western Ghats. And in the Western Ghats region, again, another challenge these people have felt that, in the Tibetan region, they never experienced the forest life as thick as the Western Ghats, And subsequently, there were challenges they started facing into, maybe the clash with the elephants, the man-animal conflict, as we are discussing. So then the snake bites, which is one of the major things that the Tibetans faced in the southern Indian region, especially with respect to Mungod. Though 4,000 odd acres was given to them, but today if you see, the Mungod is entirely different Mungod, that entire settlement. But the 4,000 acres of forest was converted into the agricultural land. That's a major thing. That's in the first generation people have done. They literally built a dam, and the dam still exists there in order to bring waters, to cultivate the lands, to bring the irrigation facilities. For all these purposes, the first generation Tibetan migrants, Tibetan population was engaged by the state government as well. And subsequently, they were paid for that, those kind of works. How the Tibetans are engaged, if you look at the narratives of the Tibetans in the early stages, in the northern Indian regions, mostly they talk about the construction of the roads. And engagement with the other military and other things. But when it comes to South, this is a different kind of an activities they have engaged into. Well, apart from that, currently it hosts 17,000 population, which is one of the largest. It makes one of the largest Tibetan settlements, which is completely a wall. It's not exactly the walled community, but yes, you can say in that region, because it is away from the villages. It is in entirely even it's not even suburban. It is in the even currently also in the part of the Western Ghats. So there is very least interaction with the local community. That has probably as an advantage that the Mungod is enjoying into, probably enjoyed that time as well, because there is least possibility for the assimilation with the local community, wherein the local community has no idea of what even Hindi and English is all about. So because they are more engaged with the local, the Kannada language, or probably they have their own Siddhi, Konkani and other local languages that are spoken in that region. So that's probably one of the advantages that early settlers in Mungod had on this matter. To start with, I would like to mention some of the literatures that I have gone through in this part. Here in the 2007 paper, Esmond talks about how social situation performs and ways for the refugees make sense of the exile and reconstruction of the connectivity in disrupted life. Drawing the ethnographic, this is a Bosnian situation wherein talks about wherein the personal resources and other political acts and how it talks about the construction of the identity part. Then Malik is one of the major refugee studies author, and subsequently this talks about the ethnographic classic shows that the first generation, this is about a Hutu generation, Hutu refugees that part into. Then comes to my another work on that, which talks about more of a home and displacement and how it's continually related to through the cultural performances, social media activities, community rituals, illustrating that memories in the both fixed as well as the mobile personal. Then comes to how the memories of the trauma. This is another part of it because trauma is one major part, whether it is 50 years, 60 years, that one cannot erase it from the minds. So similarly, the examples of how in the post India-Pakistan division, how the Pakistani people who migrated from side of the Pakistan, how they felt it. The same thing was provided by the Qatarian 2016 papers. Well, the idea of home, that is one important part because it's when we call it the homeland. As many scholars have noted that traditionally that refers to both the physical as well as the dwelling symbolizes space. And in this case, for the very idea of home, that is which is necessary, that number of people who are crossing over the boundaries either out of their choice this is one involuntary is increasing, involuntary matters are increasing, and also the people beginning to live away from their native places, their rethinking of this concept, etc. So that is how the idea of a home was built. That whether this is this my land, that's again another question. Then obviously the connectivity with the homeland, that's one of the prime reason for the identity matters into. So the theoretical basis that I have used for my studies is the one is on diaspora identity constructions, role of cultural memories, etc. That is one is by the Benedict Anderson, and another on Stuart Sall, theories of the cultural identity. Methodology was, as I mentioned, that it was on the basis of the semi-structural qualitative methods, primarily in-depth interviews methods, and these interviews conducted in Tibetan languages because the primary refugees they hardly speak in Hindi or English languages, so it was used through the help of a language translating supporters. Some of the observations that what I have witnessed during this time is elderly interview for this study were recalled the vivid memories of the life in Tibet, their journey from Tibetan regions to the marketplace of the Lhasas, maybe the southern regions wherein on the foothills of the Mount Everest, the villages, the life of the villages, etc. The tending on the axe. Attending the monasteries and participating in the local festivals, local celebrations, etc. And many of these, even the Chinese violence, how the Chinese entered into their areas. Some of the narratives that talks about how one person who remembers his father who was tortured by the Chinese military and subsequently was forced to he made the entire family to move from that area and subsequently take shelter in one of the regions. But out of four kids, his brothers and mother who started walking from the region to the south from the region in Tibet towards India, and as they entered in India, because of the change in weather and other factors, all of his three brothers died during that journey. He was the only survivors, but by the time he reaches the South India, his mother also passed away. So he was the only person remaining. So that's kind of a stories are there, and even in one of the monks who talks about how tears frozen about the faces of the Himalayas, that like how it is a very difficult part for them to come and work here in this manner. That's number one part. Second one is the farming culture. The farming culture was not there earlier as they practiced in that, because many of one perception is that the wealthy Tibetans settled there and only the middle and lower community has moved away from that. No, nothing of that kind, because there were because the people to whom I have spoken to, that there were many people who were once upon a time wealthy, belonging to the wealthy families. They had cars and bungalows and whatnot in many parts of the Tibet, and subsequently they left everything there and they came back here, started working as a laborers, subsequently cultivated land and these kind of things. That is one part. There are the Tibetans that remembers the majestic snow, they covered with the mountains, the valleys, the clean air, the clean waters, the cool weather, but yeah, in southern India, so none of these are available. So further, they also talks about the physical features of the physical, like there are impacts on them. They started witnessing into. Then the land of the Tibet itself was reconstructed. They try to reconstruct the language, religion based on the religion environment. Negotiating with the identity exiles, the identity for the elder Tibetans was ongoing negotiations between the cultural preservations and adaptation of the Indian society. While they celebrate relatively autonomous settlement, in the citizens remains a maker's settlement. Very interesting part is that, like many of these people still feel that, when once upon the Kal Chakra puja was conducted in the Mungod settlement, and that place is still there. And the Tibetans still, like elderly people, they still take around into that pradakshina. They come on every day. It is just to reassert their relationship or belief that like the Kal Chakra still exist in that particular thing. There are different external actors and the external in this politics as well, because apart from the refugees, in the absence of the citizens, because they thought that one day they will go back, but it's almost 60 plus, nearing 70 years of the exile, which is largely the idea is largely diminishing. Most of the Tibetans they say that they get to know about the Tibetans, the happening in the Tibetans through the messages that are coming from the Tibetan regions. The new arrivals into the region, they tell them the stories about the Tibetans, how the Tibet has changed. Tibet has changed. Maybe on the lighting a lamp, or maybe going through the prayers, conducting the Kal Chakra and the other side of the pujas and daily prayers, and that has made them to remain the kind of a thing. But there are certain challenges that still have faced into that, the change of some of the cultures and practices, maybe the kind of the naming ceremonies or the marriages, etc. So they have witnessed a lot of changes over the years, but yes, they still try to work onto that. So, majorly discussions about this as the narratives in Mungod elders that illustrate the identity in exile is sustained through the memory and the rituals and community practices. And by applying the social identity theory, that helps explain the collective belonging to reinforced through the shared narratives of the homeland. Communication accommodation theory that talks about that one of the applications that I did. So it talks about the linguistic practices how maintain the Tibetan language, and still that is engaging in this context. Because in the Tibetan school that are taught only in Kannada and English, so but still the local the language they try to speak is about the Tibetans. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent paper that was presented this morning as the last paper. Many issues of great relevance to all of us in terms of integration of Tibetans here, 5 years can be drawn with what happened to the Sri Lankan refugees when they came. They were also isolated, they remained in separate camps. I was very closely involved with this because I was the regional commander there. And every day you would have boatloads of people landing at Dhanushkoti, and we had to be relocated, rehabilitated, provided opportunities. And I don't think the Indian government has differentiated between any refugee, irrespective of where they came from. And that's something which holds the Indian government in good stead. And in fact, some of the Tamilian refugees that I have known personally, the Sri Lankan refugees who are of Tamil origin, some of them are PhDs, doctors, engineers, teaching in Indian universities, practicing outside. There's a kind of opportunity which are there. I'm sure there are similar examples of even the Tibetans who have been well integrated. And while the loss of identity is always something that looms large, what's interesting is that they have a very supportive environment here in India. You know, if you imagine that something like 4,000 hectares was cleared up just to clear agricultural land, you can imagine the extent to which that the government, both the state government and the central government, have gone in facilitating the process of adaptation and the social securitization processes. I think this is something that we need to be very proud of, particularly because of the fact that, as was also brought out by Aastha, that we are not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, and that we've supported their aspirations and ambitions. That's something that's very encouraging. Yes, the points that are brought out by Gudi is very, very important in terms of what is their future. This is where perhaps we need to look at the discussions. Yesterday, after dinner, we all assembled in that small room next door for ice breaking. And, if you look at those photographs, which have been framed along the wall, it tells you the real stories, photographic evidences of, the kind of sequencing which was there applied by the Chinese right from the 50s onwards in terms of deploying their army, having given, there's one photograph, which tells you a story. In 1962 itself, 1961-62, there is a video camera which was installed on one of the poles in Tibet. This is 62. And today there is heightened surveillance. Every 300, 400 meters there are these modern technological devices which are installed, which have face recognition features which are there. Therefore, they are able to spot and see who's a guy who's up to some kind of a mischief. So there is phenomenal amount of control that has been there. So all this has come in the way of identifying what is the future, what is the way ahead, where does it lie? The limited population that we have here, whether it is whatever it is the number. I think the total population itself is about 6 lakhs in Tibet, and I don't know how many are here. Yesterday I was asking this question, and they said maybe 7,000 people are here. So when you're looking at the numbers, they are not very large, but there is support at the international level, at the social level, but there are many, many questions. From that point of view, I think Aastha also brought out about the so-called ambiguity. It's also brought out by the first speaker. There is clear ambiguity, to put it mildly, on how we deal with this entire situation. So there are, before I open the house for questions, just 2-3 points from my side on this. I'm sure all of you have looked at this book, which has been acclaimed for its frankness. I'm talking about the Tibet Explained book, which some of you may have read, or I believe the Indian edition is called the Tibet 2020, Michael Walt. So I believe it brings out clearly about the Chinese ways in which they try to subjugate the Tibetan population. So it's a must-read for scholars who are looking at Tibet, in addition to many other volumes which are there, which are now available in public domain. So it is important to understand why did we reach where we are today, and what perhaps is the future. With that, we still have another 15 minutes or so, and I'd request all of you to put your hands up and ask questions. Only request is that please identify yourself.